everybody, and welcome back to POL 305. Today, we're going to be talking about the final of the four models of judicial decision making that we'll discuss in this class, and that's the psychological model. So, what I want to get through in this lesson is to, talk about the psychological model, and more importantly, we're getting into the reading component of the course where you're actually engaging with some academic research. And today we're going to talk about a reading that relates to the psychological model by, I'm not sure if it's Aliota or Aliata, but that's who we're reading today. So, the psychological model. Judges have innate personality traits. Because judges are people too, they necessarily have personality traits. And personality is the lens through which we receive information. We've talked a lot in this class so far about people perceiving things differently based on a host of features, but personality is one of the psychologists have long found personality to be a systematic way through which people receive information, how that information is passed on, how that information is interpreted. So we talked about things like ideology already. Ideology is a lens through which people perceive things. So too is personality. So judges perceive information in different ways. We know that to be true. And they act on impulses differently. And they do that because of different personalities. And we should be able to take what we know about their personalities and bring that to bear on the decisions they make when they're judging. We know this because particular personality traits compel people to behave differently. So in the same way, they'll compel judges to behave differently in certain circumstances. Okay, certain personality traits motivate certain behaviors. We know that through decades of psychological research that different personality traits motivate different behaviors. I don't think you have to think too hard to know that that's true in your own life and for those people around you. The good news is, for our purposes, that many different psychological traits can be measured across different people and different contexts and things like that. There's a lot of different ways to do this. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details today. It's not really that important for this class. A psychology class might be a better place for that type of thing, but there are things like the big five personality traits. There's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Right, those five have consistently been found to describe a lot about a person. There are other personality traits like need for achievement, need for association, need for cognition, these different types of things, right? And there's all sorts of ways to measure those. What the psychological model suggests about judges is that if we measure some of these traits, or if we pick one or two of them or whatever and measure them, they should be able to predict how judges behave in certain types of cases. Psychological model is never going to say we always know how a judge is going to vote, but it can be pretty certain about context. So the psychological model would say certain psychological traits predict how judges behave in certain types of cases. Just like was true in the strategic model, it's important to know that the psychological model is not replacing the attitudinal model. It is adding on a little bit more. It still believes that ideology is a really important part of the way judges behave. You're not going to find anybody outside of the proponents of the legal model who say, oh, ideology is unimportant. Everybody, the psychological model, attitudinal, and strategic models all believe that attitudes and ideology are very important. Okay, so what is some of the evidence for the psychological model? Well, before we get into Aliota, I'll give you one little bit of evidence, and so this is by a group of researchers, and they ask, do some of these different character traits impact how willing a certain justice is to bargain on the content of Supreme Court opinions? If you think back to a couple of lessons ago, I talked about how when the justices are writing the majority opinion, somebody who wants to sign on might say, oh, Justice so-and-so, I really liked Section 2, but could you add this paragraph to Section 3? That's that's bargaining, right? So if the justice who wrote it decided to incorporate what the other justice wanted into Section 3, they would be considered to have bargained over the opinion content of the Supreme Court opinion. So here the question is, are some justices based on personality more or less willing to do that? And the theory that these researchers come up with is that need for achievement, outside of the context of judges, need for achievement for everybody, it just motivates people to get work done, right? They want to see a finished product or something like that. So just by the nature of being people, justices are going to be the same way. A high need for achievement justice is going to want to get work done. And as it pertains to opinion content, they might be more likely to bargain because the faster they can bargain and the faster they can get that justice on board, the quicker they're going to see a finished product. So the idea is that the need for achievement is going to influence bargaining behavior. Justices high in a need for achievement are more likely to bargain. The hypothesis here is a formal way to state what I just said informally. Judges high in need for achievement will be more willing to bargain than judges low in need for achievement. Okay? So the way these researchers measure these various characteristics, the dependent variable is, did a judge bargain in a particular case? If they did, the dependent variable takes on a value of 1. If they did not, the dependent variable takes on a value of 0. Just as a sort of a side note, when a dependent variable is measured as 0 or 1, what we end up talking about is probabilities that something's going to occur. Probability is always between 0 and 1, or between a 0% chance of something occurring and a 1% chance of something occurring. So even though the dependent variable is only measured as 0 and 1, we can, through some simple mathematics that we're not going to talk about, we can ultimately describe probabilities of a justice bargaining. So I'll say in a few seconds something like a 0.15 probability of bargaining. Just know that we can always do that when we're talking about a 0-1 dependent variable. The independent variable is need for achievement, and that's measured by a computer program that's designed by linguists and psychologists that's measured to do this. They use documents written by justices, and it spits out a score. So higher values indicate a high need for achievement score, and lower values a low need for achievement score. So what we see here is on the y-axis here, we have the probability of bargaining over opinion content. And here on the x-axis, down here, where my pen can't go, we have achievement motive. So, need for achievement from 0.16 up to 0.71. So the justice who is at 0.16, pretty low in the need for achievement. The justice that is at 0.71, pretty high in need for achievement. And what we see here, for the justice low in need for achievement, their probability of bargaining over the content of a final opinion is below 0.15. It's probably about 0.145. Now, contrast that with this justice over here, who's very high in need for achievement. So if you take a, that doesn't look good. Sorry. So if you, my mouse is kind of going wacky here. Take this this horizontal projection over from that point and look at the value on the y-axis. We see that a high need for achievement justice is much more likely, by about 0.1 probability, or about 10%. They're about 10% more likely to bargain over opinion content. So what we see here is that there is an increase in willingness, or the probability of bargaining, across achievement motives, such that high achieving justices are more willing to bargain. So there's some pretty decent evidence that there is something to this idea that psychological traits that are innate within us lead to various outcomes in the judicial realm. Much like the other models we've talked about, the psychological model is not perfect. Okay. One of the major issues, and you may not think this is an issue, but I think this is a pretty interesting issue. We're talking about relative versus absolute character traits. So let me go back one slide. And we see here that the justices range from about 0.16 to 0.71 on the need for achievement scale. But that's a relative scale. The lowest need for achievement justice, compared to some average Joe on the street, is probably pretty high in the need for achievement. So we're really talking about 9 people at a time who have very high need for achievement, and we're only really talking about variation within those people. So we can't really connect this back to stories about people who have high need for achievement or something like that. To say this a little bit different, a judge who is motivated at 0 might be like a 0.8 among the average public, right? Another weakness is that there's many personality traits that we can measure. Earlier, a couple slides ago, I described 9, and those were a very small smattering of the various psychological traits we could measure. The problem with that is, how do we know that we've identified the correct personality trait? A lot of these traits overlap, they're correlated. They are indeed different from one another, but they do correlate, right? It may be the case, if we think to the big 5, that somebody who's very extroverted also happens to be pretty agreeable. Those things might just go hand in hand, right? Somebody that has a lot of friends might be like that. Likewise, somebody who's very agreeable might have high need for affiliation. They want to be around a lot of people, and it works for them. So how do we know that we've identified the correct trait? We can't really answer those questions, but nevertheless, let's move on to discuss the paper by Aliotta, which you were tasked with reading. And if you haven't read it, I would recommend that you pause now and go read that before you watch the remainder of this video. So Aliotta is working in the psychological model. We're just going to jump right into what he says. His theory is that certain psychological character traits will influence judicial behavior. That's no surprise. I just showed you some evidence for that. And based on what we know about these traits, we can really relate them to actions. Again, I just showed you some evidence of that. So we can predict how judges are going to behave if we know about their personality traits. Now, I will note that Aliotta came out in the 1980s. He was sort of one of the first movers on this psychological model. So it's his argument's a little primitive relative to what you might experience somebody writing about personality today. But nevertheless, he writes about 3 important psychological characteristics. One is the need for achievement. The need for achievement, like we just talked about, it's related to concern for excellence, Aliotta writes. Justices might be concerned with legal accomplishments. For instance, they might want to write the opinion in a very salient landmark case. Because of that, they may be less likely to disagree with the majority, right? The majority opinion carries more weight than a dissenting opinion or a concurring opinion. And if they do disagree, they're more likely to write their own opinion explaining why, rather than sign on to another justice's concurring or dissenting opinion, right? So the need for achievement, they want to be able to control what they put out into the world. And they want to sort of accomplish something. And the way to do that is take control of your message. Aliotta also describes the need for power. That's related to having an impact on others. Here, that may translate to a justice wanting to lead a voting bloc. So if there are 4 conservatives and 5 liberals, 4 conservatives and 4 liberals, and there's one median justice in the middle who kind of is the swing vote, that swing justice might really just want to lead the voting bloc all the time and kind of pick how to vote or how to behave in certain cases, such that he or she really gets to lead the voting bloc. Because of this, a justice high in the need for power might be more likely to disagree with the majority opinion. They have to sort of, they're the voice of dissent. They want to lead their own way. And they're, like I mentioned a few seconds ago, they may be more likely to write a majority opinion as well if they don't disagree. So somebody high in the need for power is probably going to be writing their own opinion a lot more than somebody low in a need for power. Finally, we have the need for affiliation. This is related to having and establishing and maintaining friendships. So justices who are high in the need for affiliation, they may be concerned with conformity. They may not want to break up unanimity. They may just want everything to be kind of hunky-dory. For that reason, they're probably less likely to disagree with the majority opinion, and they're less likely to write their own opinions. They sort of join with others because that's how you maintain sort of collegial and friendly relationships. So the hypotheses, I mean, we just kind of went through them, but here I'll formally restate them. The need for achievement, power, and affiliation will influence whether a justice does the following: joins the majority, joins a concurrence or dissent, or authors his own concurrence or dissent. Okay. The way Aliotta measures these things, the dependent variable is a percentage of cases in a judge's or a justice's career where he or she joined the majority, similarly joining the concurrence or dissent, or the percentage of time writing their own. The main independent variables here, Aliotta spent a lot of time coding transcripts of judicial nomination hearings for the 3 need for traits. Nowadays, we would have a computer do this, but this is the 1980s. Good for him. He spent a lot of time doing it. The statistical procedure, who cares? That's not what this class is about. Okay, so as we're moving into papers that talk about statistical procedures, you shouldn't concern yourself so much with it. If you're interested, shoot me an email or come see me in office hours, or we can chat about that if you're interested. But for those of you who aren't, don't worry about it. So, sort of a lot going on here. Arrange my mouse here. So what we see, this is the first argument. Okay, so this is the number of majority opinions over the number of participations. So that is the number of cases where the justice, or the percentage of cases where the justice wrote the majority opinion. And here we see that Aliotta includes need for affiliation, need for achievement, and need for power in that model as independent variables, along with political experience. Over here, if you look at these significance values, they're below 0.05, which indicates that that is a statistically significant relationship. The negative sign here shows us that the need for affiliation means a justice is less likely to write the majority opinion. High need for achievement means the justice is less likely to write the majority opinion, and high need for power suggests that they're more likely to write the majority opinion. Excuse me, that's not write the majority opinion, that's just joining the majority opinion. So all those things I just said aren't writing, it's about joining the majority opinion. So we see that each of these 3 need for variables do have a statistically significant effect. We could see that the sign tells us the direction of that relationship. If we move next to the second model, concurring and dissenting votes, so that is the percentage of cases where they joined a concurrence or a dissent rather than joining the majority, we see that he only includes the need for achievement here. If you look over here at the significance test, it's above 0.05, which suggests it's not actually statistically significant. So we can kind of move on from that model. But there are a couple of things, place of rearing and law school, that matter there. We didn't talk about those, so moving on. Here we have the final model, where this is the, excuse me, this is the actual probability of writing separately, writing a concurrence or a dissent. And here again, there's need for affiliation and need for achievement. Neither of these are particularly significant. They're on the edge of significance, so they kind of matter, but it's hard to separate out from 0 how much they matter. So there are some problems with this paper. He only has data for 15 of 32 justices in the time span that he was able to study. That's not a lot. So it's hard to make systematic claims about all justices when you're only using a subset of them. As you noticed, there were some very important variables that were missing, namely ideology. What if one of the justices that he had in his sample was a conservative justice who served in the 1960s and 70s, where the court was traditionally liberal. Well, that justice was probably always going to be joining the dissent. It had nothing to do with the need for affiliation, power, or achievement. It just had to do with the fact that he was ideologically opposed to the Supreme Court's majority. The statistical procedures here are terrible. Not a big deal for this class, but, again, see me if you'd like. This is the 1980s. What can you say? So, a couple of thoughts on Aliotta and sort of his approach to the psychological model. I'm wondering if you buy the story. Do you think it is the case that things like need for achievement, need for affiliation, and need for power really influence the way that judges behave? And I also want you to think about what are some potential confounds. I just told you one of them, ideology. What I mean by a confound is, are there any variables that were omitted that might correlate with need for power, achievement, or affiliation that aren't in the models but should be? And if they were in the models, we would see that they mattered, but those need for traits didn't matter. Okay, so that's it for the psychological model. As you can see, some of the evidence is mixed. I would say the evidence being mixed in Aliotta's case is just due to being a little older and not being as well thought out and as thorough as it might have been if we did that study again today with more justices. But as we see, the psychological model, much like the strategic model, takes what we know about judges, mainly that they're influenced by various things. They're influenced by a whole host of things, including ideology. But there's also some innate personality traits that may ultimately influence what they do on the bench. All right. Talk to you next time.